Detective James Walker stood in the cold morning air, staring at the old church building. 9 bells hung silent in the tower above, their ropes dangling like frozen snakes. Below them lay the body of Thomas Bell, the church's bell ringer for 40 years. Quite strange, isn't it? Officer Peter said, walking up beside Walker. Found him this morning when he didn't show up for the Sunday service. Door was locked from the inside. Walker nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. Bell's body lay face down on the wooden floor, surrounded by the bell ropes. No signs of a struggle, no weapon visible. Just an old man who appeared to have fallen while preparing to ring the morning bells. Time of death? Walker asked. Doctor estimates between 4 and 5 a.m. He came in early to practice the special ring for today's service. Walker walked carefully around the body, noting every detail. Bell wore his usual Sunday clothes, pressed black pants, white shirt, polished shoes. Everything neat and proper, as the old bell ringer always insisted. Except for one thing. His gloves, Walker muttered. Where are his ringing gloves? Peters shrugged. Maybe he hadn't put them on yet. No, Bell always put his gloves on, first thing. Said it was bad luck to touch the ropes without them. Walker continued his inspection, moving closer to the bells themselves. The 9 bells of St. Michael's Church were famous in the region. Each had its own name, its own tone, its own history. Bell had known them all by heart, treating them more like old friends than pieces of metal. Walker examined each rope in turn, looking for anything unusual. That's when he noticed a slight discoloration on the rope of the 7th bell, Maria. He leaned in closer. The rope was slightly frayed, different from the others, which were perfectly maintained. Get me Bell's maintenance log, Walker instructed. Peters returned minutes later with a worn notebook. Walker flipped through the pages. Every bell check, every rope replacement, every minor repair, all documented in Bell's precise handwriting. The last entry was from yesterday, Maria's rope showing wear. Replace first thing Monday morning. He knew the rope was weak. He would never have used it without replacing it first. Bell was too careful for that. The detective expanded his search, examining every corner of the bell tower. In a dark corner, partially hidden behind an old wooden chest, he found what he was looking for, a pair of worn leather gloves. Walker pulled out his magnifying glass, studying the gloves carefully. There's something on these. Some kind of powder. He turned to Peters. Send these to the lab, and get me everything you can find on the church's new assistant bell ringer, Michael Reed. Over the next few days, the pieces began falling into place. The powder on the gloves was identified as a powerful sleeping drug. Michael Reed, it turned out, had a history of gambling debts. And most importantly, he stood to inherit Bell's position as head bell ringer, a prestigious role that came with a significant salary increase. A week later, Walker sat across from Reed in the interrogation room. You planned it carefully, didn't you? Walker said, laying out the evidence. You knew Bell always came in early on Sundays to practice. You knew he would never ring the bells without his gloves. And you knew about the weak rope on Maria. Reed's face remained blank, but his hands trembled slightly. You drugged his gloves, knowing the powder would be absorbed through his skin. When he fell unconscious, you positioned him under Maria's rope. One sharp pull was all it took. The frayed rope snapped, bringing the bell's clapper down. A tragic accident, or so it seemed. You can't prove any of this, Reed said, but his voice lacked conviction. Walker smiled grimly. Actually, we can. You made one mistake. You wore gloves while handling Bell's pair, but you left a single fingerprint on Maria's rope, not from the morning of the murder, but from when you deliberately frayed it the day before. Reed's shoulders slumped in defeat. The Nine Tailors, that's what they call the Nine Bells. They've been ringing out truth in this town for over 200 years, Walker said quietly. Did you really think they would let a murder go unanswered? Later that evening, Walker stood outside the church as the bells rang out for the first time since Belle's death. Their sound was somehow different now, not just musical notes, but a reminder that justice, like truth, has its own way of coming to light. The Nine Tailors of St. Michael's Church had one final story to tell, the story of a murderer who thought he could silence their keeper, only to be undone by the very bells he sought to claim as his own. Their music echoed across the town, carrying with it the age-old message that every crime, no matter how carefully planned, leaves behind its own unique signature. One just needs to know where to look. In the end, it wasn't complex forensics or modern technology that solved the case. It was understanding the victim, knowing that Thomas Bell would never break his own strict rules about bell ringing. The murderer had counted on making death look like an accident, but he hadn't counted on the dead man's dedication to his craft being the very thing that would reveal the truth. As the last notes faded into the evening air, Walker pulled his coat tighter against the chill. Tomorrow, Michael Reed would face his charges in court. Thomas Bell would be laid to rest in the church cemetery, where the sounds of his beloved bells would ring out over his grave. And the Nine Tailors would continue their centuries-old duty, marking time, celebrating joy, mourning loss, and occasionally, just occasionally, helping to solve a murder. Walker smiled as he walked away. In his line of work, it was easy to become cynical, to see only the darkness in people's hearts. But sometimes, justice came from unexpected places. Sometimes, all it took was paying attention to the small details, a pair of gloves, a frayed rope, and the dedication of a man who loved his bells enough to maintain them perfectly, even to his last day. The Nine Tailors rang on, their voices carrying across the town, telling their stories to anyone who knew how to listen. And somewhere, Walker liked to think, Thomas Bell was still listening, knowing that his beloved bells had helped bring his killer to justice.